Okay, so whenever there's a government shutdown, we usually know the script, right? It's about political fights, services getting paused. But this time, a totally new element has been thrown into the ring, a direct threat to the paychecks of federal workers even after the government is supposed to be back up and running. Let's really get into what's going on here.
And just to get a sense of the scale of what we're talking about, look at that number, 750,000 people. That's how many federal employees are furloughed. Sent home, not getting paid, their entire financial situation just thrown up in the air because of the gridlock happening in Washington.
And then came this statement. This is really what set off all the alarm bells. President Trump basically suggested that, hey, maybe not everyone is getting that back pay when this is all said and done. This one comment, it just completely upended decades of practice and set the stage for a shutdown fight like we've never seen before.
Now look, government shutdowns themselves, they're unfortunately nothing new in American politics. But the tactics being used this time around, that represents a huge escalation. It turns these furloughed employees from, unfortunate bystanders into direct leverage in the whole negotiation.
So here's a quick rundown of how we got here. The shutdown's already into its second week, and it all started with a fight over federal subsidies for health insurance. But the real game changer, the moment everything shifted, was on day 7. That's when a White House memo started making the rounds that called the whole idea of guaranteed back pay into question.
Let's really zero in on that memo for a second, because it is the absolute heart of this story. This warning from the administration, it wasn't just some off-the-cuff remark. It's being seen as a very deliberate, very new political strategy.
And pretty much everyone is interpreting it as a strong-arm tactic. The goal here seems pretty clear: create a ton of pressure, not just on the politicians, but on the federal workers themselves. The hope is that it'll force lawmakers, and let's be specific, Democrats, to give in on the funding dispute and just reopen the government.
And this is exactly why it's such a big deal. It's a massive departure from how things have always been handled. I mean, in every other shutdown, yeah, workers miss their paychecks, which is awful, but they almost always got that money back once the deal was struck. Threatening to just not pay them at all, that is a move that would almost for sure end up in court.
So, you're probably wondering, how can the administration even suggest this? Well, it all boils down to this fascinating legal showdown between the law that Congress actually passed and a brand new interpretation from the White House's own budget office.
And right here, this is where the fight really comes to a head. On one hand, you have a law from 2019, a law, by the way, signed by President Trump himself, that seems about as clear as it gets. It says furloughed workers shall be paid. But then on the other hand, his own Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, is pushing this memo that says, well, not so fast. They're arguing that law isn't automatic, that Congress would have to pass a whole other bill just to free up the cash for back pay.
As you can imagine, this new tactic just ignited an absolute firestorm on Capitol Hill. Lawmakers pretty much immediately split into these two very sharply divided camps. So, people who support the administration's move, like the House Speaker Mike Johnson, they see it as a totally legitimate tool. From their point of view, if the threat of workers losing their pay for good makes Democrats more willing to come to the table, well then it's a valid way to dial up the pressure and get this shutdown over with.
But the Democrats? They are absolutely furious. Senator Patty Murray's reaction here is a perfect example of the opposition. She's calling it an illegal, cowardly move to scare federal workers, who are basically being used as pawns in a political chess match. They're saying, look, the law is clear, and the administration is just choosing to ignore it.
But here's where it gets a little more complex. It's not a purely partisan issue. You've got some pretty important Republicans, like Senator John Thune, who are showing some real skepticism. His take is that, despite the memo, despite all the tough talk, history is going to win out. He's assuming that at the end of the day, Congress will step in and make sure those workers get paid just like they always have.
So where does all this leave us? We're smack in the middle of a super high-stakes political standoff, where, really for the first time ever, the actual paychecks of hundreds of thousands of people are being used as an explicit bargaining chip.
So, to just boil it all down, you've got a law that seems pretty clear being challenged by a very controversial legal memo. You have the paychecks for 750,000 workers just hanging in the balance, and it's all part of this intense pressure campaign to break a political stalemate. This is a huge, huge break from the past, and it could set a really explosive precedent for any shutdowns that happen down the road.
Which, of course, leaves us with this one big question. Is weaponizing federal paychecks actually going to force everyone to a resolution, or is it just going to make the political divide that much deeper and make it even harder for anyone to cooperate in the future? The answer to that is going to define not just how this shutdown ends,
but maybe the rules of the game for years to come.